Hey there, lovely soul. Welcome back to Noah's Stories. Thank you for spending your time with me today. I hope that as you watch this story unfold, you'll find yourself swept into a world where emotions are real, where hearts ache and heal, and where love shows up in the most unexpected ways. By the time this video ends, I want you to feel a little warmer, a little more hopeful, and maybe, just maybe, you'll start believing in love all over again. Today's story is one you won't want to pause. It begins with a cold agreement between two people who never intended to fall in love, but fate had its own plans. So grab a cozy drink, sit back, and let your heart open up to something truly unforgettable. Are you ready? Let's begin. Elena Ramirez had lived her whole life under a spotlight. Not the kind that lit up stages, but the harsh glare of politics. As the only daughter of the city's beloved mayor, she had been trained from childhood to embody grace, poise, and perfection. Public smiles, carefully measured words, calculated charm. But in her heart, all she ever wanted was to paint. For Elena, art was her escape, the only language her soul truly spoke. Damien Cole was her opposite in every way. At 32, he was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech empire, known for his ruthless business acumen and impenetrable coldness. The media called him the man incapable of love, and he never bothered to deny it. Their marriage was never meant to be about love. It was a transaction, one carefully crafted between Elena's father and Damien, each with something to gain. A month-long marriage. No intimacy, no emotion, a facade for the cameras. A merger of influence, nothing more. On the wedding day, beneath a canopy of crystal lights, and before an audience of press, politicians, and power brokers, Damien stood tall at the altar and spoke, without a flicker of hesitation. No love, no touch, in 1 month, we walk away. A murmur rippled through the room. Elena didn't cry. She didn't falter. She simply lifted her chin, her eyes calm and steady as they met his. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. The ceremony continued, elegant but hollow. There was no kiss, only a clasp of hands to seal the agreement. There was no room for romance, no space for longing. This was a business deal, cold, calculated, and temporary. But the thing about hearts, they don't follow rules. Damien's penthouse overlooked the beating heart of New York City. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline like art, casting golden reflections across sleek marble and minimalist furnishings. It was pristine, elegant, expensive, and utterly devoid of warmth. Elena moved through the space like a shadow, present yet barely seen. They didn't eat together, they barely spoke except for the occasional logistical exchange. Damien often worked late, and when he did return, he kept his distance with a precision that felt surgical. She slept on one side of the penthouse, he stayed on the other. Silence became their most consistent language. To Elena, it was a familiar ache. She had long ago learned how to survive in the absence of affection, raised in a world where image came before intimacy, where duty replaced desire. But something about Damien's silence felt colder, heavier. He wasn't cruel, just unreachable, as if he'd built walls around himself so high he couldn't remember what it was like to let anyone in. Sometimes, though, just for a moment, she'd catch him watching her. His gaze would linger, almost soft, almost curious. But always, he looked away. She didn't expect anything more. She had agreed to this. No love, no touch. And yet, on nights when the city lights flickered across the floor and her bed felt too big, Elena would wonder, doesn't everyone, no matter how guarded, crave the warmth of a touch that means something? To the world, they were perfection. But inside this glass fortress, they were just two people trying not to feel too much. Because feelings were never part of the plan. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She let soft jazz play through the speakers, the mellow notes drifting like a lullaby through the empty penthouse. In a champagne-colored silk slip, she stepped barefoot onto the marble floor, drawn to the moonlight pouring in through the glass walls that stretched to the ceiling. Her skin, pale and porcelain-like, shimmered beneath the silvery glow. Her long blonde hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, glinting like threads of gold under the moonlight. As the music swelled, her body began to move, slowly, gracefully, as if every note painted a stroke across the air. In that moment, Elena wasn't the mayor's daughter. She wasn't the wife trapped in a cold, calculated contract. She was simply herself, unfiltered, unguarded, and utterly free. She didn't know Damien had returned. He stood in the shadows near the doorway, tie loosened, the top buttons of his shirt undone, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were fixed on her. Elena moved with effortless beauty, her silk dress gliding against her body, her golden hair trailing as she turned, lips slightly parted as if she were whispering a secret only the night could hear. Something cracked deep inside him. He had spent his entire life building walls, hard, cold, indestructible, walls meant to protect him from pain, from love, from needing anyone. But in that moment, watching her move through the moonlight, something slipped, something unraveled. She stopped, sensing him. Their eyes met, hers wide and still, his dark and stormy. Silence stretched between them, charged and heavy. Damien stepped closer, one step, then another. He stopped just inches from her. His hand lifted, hesitated in the space between them. It trembled slightly before he pulled it back, jaw clenched as if fighting a war inside his own chest. "Don't look at me like that," he said quietly, voice rough. "Like what?" she whispered. "Like you see me." Elena didn't reply. Her eyes, however, remained locked onto his, a storm of emotions swirling within, yet her gaze remained steady and unflinching. He turned and walked away, leaving the air humming with everything unspoken. Later that night, as Elena stood at the window, her arms wrapped around herself, her golden hair glowing beneath the moonlight, she still felt the weight of his gaze. He could turn away, but his walls had already begun to crack, and something warm, wild, and dangerously real was seeping in. 2 weeks after that night, something started to shift, quietly but undeniably. Damien began coming home earlier. His eyes would find Elena the moment he walked through the door. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't cold anymore. It was heavy with something unspoken. During a business trip, they were accidentally assigned the same suite at a villa. Or maybe it wasn't an accident at all. Elena stepped out of the bathroom, wrapped in a thin silk robe, her pale skin still flushed from the shower. Her damp blonde hair cascaded down her back in soft waves, clinging slightly to her shoulders. Damien stood by the window, his dress shirt unbuttoned, his dark hair damp. When he turned and saw her, time seemed to hold its breath. Their eyes locked. His chest tightened. His gaze dropped, then rose slowly, taking her in inch by inch. "Elena," he warned, his voice gravelly. She stopped, facing him. "You don't have to look at me like that," she said softly. "Like what?" he asked, his throat dry. "Like you want to touch me, but you're terrified of what it might do to you." He took one step forward, then froze. "I don't know how to love," he said, voice low and raw. "No one ever taught me. My mother left when I was a boy. No goodbye, just gone. My father never flinched, just poured himself into his work and told me to do the same. I wasn't raised with affection. I was trained to win, to succeed, to never show weakness. Love was weakness." Elena stood still, heart aching for the little boy still hiding inside this powerful man. "But then you," he continued, voice trembling, "you saw me. And suddenly I was feeling things I thought I'd locked away for good." She stepped closer, lifting her hand to touch his face gently. "Damien, you are loving, you just don't realize it yet." He closed his eyes, resting his forehead against hers. His breath shuddered. "You scare me," he whispered. "I'm scared too," she said quietly. "But I'm still here." Damien didn't say another word because his body spoke for him. Elena stood in front of him, her green eyes searching his face. There was no judgment in her gaze, no pressure, only presence. Pure, grounding presence. and it unraveled him more than any touch ever could. He pulled her into his arms. The kiss came fast, urgent, heated, but softened into something achingly tender. It wasn't just desire. It was everything he had been trying not to feel. But she didn't pull away. Breaths mingled, hands explored, hearts pounded. Damien lifted her into his arms and laid her on the bed like she was something fragile and priceless all at once. His hands traced every inch of her, as if he was trying to memorize her body, her warmth, her very essence. They came together like a storm meeting still water, fierce, quiet, unstoppable. No rules, no contract, just skin against skin, breath against breath, soul against soul. And in the middle of it all, as Elena whispered his name and held him tighter, Damien knew every rule he'd set, every promise he'd made, all of it shattered, because nothing could survive this kind of truth. There would be no going back. The next morning, Elena woke in Damien's arms. He was still asleep, his breathing steady, his face uncharacteristically peaceful. She watched him for a long moment, heart quietly hopeful. Something had shifted. She could feel it. But just hours later, that fragile hope was shattered. While looking for her tablet in Damien's study, Elena noticed a folder lying on the desk, partially open. Curious, she reached for it. Her breath caught on the very first page. Marriage agreement, objective, strategic partnership to improve Damien Cole's public image through union with the mayor's daughter. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages. Every line cut deeper, slicing through the soft beginnings of trust she hadn't even realized had taken root. Behind her, the door creaked open. Damien stepped in, pausing as his eyes landed on the folder in her hands. "Elena?" She turned to face him. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shimmered with hurt. "Did you know about this?" He hesitated, his gaze flicked to the document. "Yeah." Just one word, colder than all the silence that had come before it. "So it's true," she whispered. "Everything last night was just part of the plan?" "No." Damien moved toward her, his voice breaking. "Elena, listen. Yes, it started that way, but it's not like that anymore. You changed everything. But you didn't tell me. You let me feel something real while you knew it was built on a lie. I was afraid," he admitted, eyes pleading. "Afraid I'd find out you used me? No, afraid you'd leave." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "Well, now you don't have to be afraid anymore," she said softly, "because you already lost me." And this time, it was Elena who walked away, and she didn't look back. 3 weeks later, Elena stood in the middle of her first art gallery. Soft golden light bathed the room, falling gently over paintings that carried every fragment of her soul, her pain, her longing, the pieces of herself she had never dared speak aloud. Guests moved slowly, admiring her work, offering compliments in hushed tones. But Elena, she felt hollow, because the one person she wanted to share this moment with wasn't there, until the room suddenly fell silent. Damien walked in. Wearing a black suit, eyes locked on hers, he crossed the gallery with quiet purpose. The crowd instinctively parted around him, as though even the air gave him space. He stopped in front of Elena, said nothing. Then slowly, he knelt. Gasps spread through the room like ripples in water. From his pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box. McKay opened it. A diamond ring sparkled under the gallery lights. "I once told you I wouldn't love you, wouldn't touch you, that after 1 month, we'd be done." Damien looked up, voice low and raw. "But you broke all of that. You made me feel. You made me need. You made me afraid of losing you." Elena couldn't speak. Her heart pounded in her chest. "I'm not asking you to stay because of a contract," he said. "I'm asking you to be my wife. Truly. No conditions, no timeline." "Damien," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I love you, Elena, and if you let me, I'll love you for the rest of my life." She sank to her knees beside him. In the thick emotional silence of the room, Elena placed her trembling hand over his. "Yes," she whispered. And this time, it was for love. It was a late summer afternoon. Sunlight spilled warmly through the tall windows of the studio, casting golden hues across the hardwood floor. Elena stood at her easel, one hand resting gently over the gentle curve of her belly, where life was quietly growing, day by day. The air was still, filled only with the gentle whisper of the ocean breeze wafting through the open windows, carrying with it the salty scent of the sea and the faint scent of oil paint lingering like a memory. She wore a simple ivory slip dress, her fair skin glowing in the light, blonde hair falling softly down her back. In her eyes, peace. The kind that only comes when a woman has finally come home to herself. The door creaked open. Damien stepped in, sleeves rolled up, shirt slightly undone, her forgotten sketchbook in his hand. He stopped when he saw her turn slightly, one hand protectively on her stomach. "Ilia?" His voice was low, tentative. She smiled and reached for his hand. "Here," she whispered, guiding it to rest over her belly. He froze. His palm lay flat against the soft fabric, and beneath it, something. A flutter, a heartbeat. His hand trembled. "Is this real?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded. 3 months. He dropped to his knees, forehead resting gently against her stomach, arms wrapping around her waist as if anchoring himself to her. His breath hitched, voice shaking. "You've given me everything. Your love, your trust, and now a family." Her fingers threaded gently through his hair. "You deserve it all." He looked up at her, eyes wet but burning with something fierce and unshakable. "I don't know how to be a father," he whispered, "but I swear I'll learn. I'll try. I'll be here. Always." She leaned down, kissed his forehead softly. "You are my home, Damien. You and this baby." And in that sun-drenched room, where everything had once started with a cold contract, a family was born. Not through promises, but through love. Time passed. Some days were warm and golden, others gray and quiet. But in the home Elena and Damien built, love never faded. Their daughter arrived on a soft spring morning, with deep ocean blue eyes and sunshine blonde hair. Damien held her in his arms, chest trembling. Not from fear, but from a kind of joy he never believed he deserved. Elena painted their first family portrait in gentle colors, the shades of love, healing, and new beginnings. They had come so far, from strangers forced into a contract to a family built not by obligation, but by choice, by courage, and by a love they had to fight for. To you, yes, you. Thank you for staying until the very last second of this journey. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to Noah's Stories, and turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to embark on our next emotional journey. What moment stayed with you the most? Was it the gallery proposal, the silent dance in the moonlight, or the whispered yes that changed everything? Let me know in the comments below. I read every word you share, sending you warmth, love, and gratitude. See you in the next story.